はい。本日はですね、インパクト志向金融宣言主催の、セミナーにご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。本日ですね、システムレベル投資というところで、最近いろいろなところで話題になってますけれども、システムレベルインベスティングを、かなり前からですね、アメリカでコンサルティング会社としてですね、取り組まれて、来られました、ウィリアム・バッカート氏をお招きしてですね、今日お話を聞いてみようということになっております。そして、贅沢なことにですね、PRI の理事をされていらっしゃいます、木村さんもですね、コメントくださるということで、まず、ビルさんにお話をいただいた後にですね、木村さんからお話をいただいて、そして、Q&A セッションという形で進んでいければと思っております。質疑応答のところはですね、もし日本語の方がよろしければ日本語で、ご質問いただいても、構いませんので、よろしくお願いいたします。So, I was just, explaining today's agenda, and then you please welcome Bill Buckard for this seminar. So, could you please start, Bill-san?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction and thank you all for joining us. So over to the next 30 minutes or so, I am going to cover essentially the why, what, and how of system level investing. And so as I take you through this, definitely, please flag any questions in the comments. Happy to address them when it's all said and done. And I would also say, Yuka-san, if I end up talking too fast or something like that, like don't hesitate to slow me down. Okay.
Okay, I'll do that.
All right. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to cover four big ideas. The first is that systems are important, really, really important, that there's now a baseline of theory and evidence for system level investing, that investors are demonstrating how to adopt their policies, programs, and practices to the system level and adopt new techniques. And that fourth, there's a global community of practice that is growing. So let's start with one of the big kind of, systems are important, really important. So this quote comes from two guys, Jim Hawley and John LeComic. I'm going to return to those names later, but they essentially did some work that helped to demonstrate the fact that, the returns that an investor can expect, up to 75 to 90% of the variation in those returns is actually due to the health of the overall economy, not individual stock picking. And so part of their whole big hypothesis is just to say that while most investors are solely focused on seeking alpha, that they really should be also focused on building beta, so building the health of the economy. And we're broadly defining beta in that context. That's an important point. I just wanted to flag at the beginning because a lot of what we're talking about, particularly for institutional investors with a very long-term time horizon, this is the acknowledgement that they are slowly but surely starting to realize that if they really are going to ensure stable performance, a healthy world of investable opportunities, and ultimately contribute to global prosperity, that they need to be thinking about that health of the economy and investing in a way that helps them to essentially manage that. When I say that there's a number of investors that are beginning to slowly start to understand and embrace that, here are two in particular. So the first quote comes from Harry Kiley, the chair of CalSTRS, which is one of the biggest pension plans in the world. And basically him talking about that they have made this commitment to system level and strategies because it essentially will speak to how they can make good on their promise to their beneficiaries. Same thing, the CIO of Westpath, another pension manager, basically talking about in reaction to a number of major asset managers leaving their commitments to Climate Action 100 plus, basically saying that this is now going to be a consideration point when they go to hire managers to manage their money or to otherwise keep managers managing their money. And what this is, it's just this kind of further acknowledgement that systems under stress create these system-wide risks and opportunities that then become idiosyncratic risks and opportunities, and that ultimately the viability of investments as well as the viability of society are kind of intertwined, that there are these feedback loops between them, and that ultimately the decisions that investors make every day, individually and collectively, really do have an influence on the health of those systems, and that those systems, when healthy, are great for investment. When they're not, they're bad. So a lot of this is predicated on essentially two big limitations. The first is that the big question is, why is it that conventional investing, so modern portfolio theory, how most investors are trained, why is that not enough now to manage these big systemic risks? And so this graphic is from Duncan Austin, Thinking Ahead Institute. And basically what it's trying to depict here is just this idea that most participants in the market really do focus on the invisible hand. So Adam Smith, economics theory, right? What it does is it obscures or otherwise keeps hidden the unmentionable foot. So all of the things that are required, the costs that are required to drive the opportunities and performance of that invisible hand, all of those things that are getting externalized onto society, that's what's happening behind the curtain. So a lot of investors are not truly seeing the true costs or the true opportunities that are inherent in this dynamic. And so the big question that has slowly been dawning on these investors, particularly as these big systemic issues, so think climate change, think income inequality, think biodiversity loss, things that are increasingly observable and investors are increasingly acknowledging, they're also coming to the understanding that, at the end of the day, these big risks are becoming more complex, they're becoming more interconnected, and that they're ultimately starting to offset any of they're overwhelming rather. So they're overwhelming that invisible hand. Because the idea was always that whatever the market is achieving, it would be so great that it would offset any of those social or environmental failures that are ultimately being pushed onto society and onto the environment. And the reality is, it's just these issues have become too complex, they become too interconnected, and they're now overwhelming that invisible hand. Now, the broad field of impact investing and sustainable finance also has its limitations in terms of really grappling with this whole reality. And so what's depicted here is basically green infrastructure. So we're all familiar with a lot of innovative climate solutions, things like that. And what it's showing is that, yes, that's exciting. And then there's this older woman that's basically saying, are we building this essentially on solid ground? Because at the end of the day, this kind of paradigm of externality denying capitalism, so the denial of all of these things to truly cost in like the realities of production, to truly capture the inherent value and worth of these common pooled resources, and then ultimately to manage them most effectively, we're not quite there. So we can build really incredible funds that are investing in companies that are avoiding carbon emissions or creating jobs, things like that. But we still tend to view them from a portfolio focus. So it's very much about what that specific company or what that specific fund has achieved, as opposed to really understanding, well, what is that in the context of the greater problem that we're ultimately trying to address? So we may be making some incremental gains, but at the end of the day, the world just continues to get more unfair and the environment becomes more unstable. So this brings us to the next big idea. There is this kind of solution that's now emerging, this kind of baseline of theory and practice for system level investing. And to step back for a second, so when TIIP was established, so we were established in 2015 by myself, who comes out of more of the private market impact investment world, and my co-founder, a gentleman named Steve Leidenberg, who comes out more from the public market ESG integration world. And the two of us came together out of this shared frustration that, yet again, we're telling good portfolio stories, but the world seems to keep getting worse. So what are we doing wrong? It speaks to this name that we came up with, this very awkward name, the Investment Integration Project. It was just a simple idea that we now need to be integrating both portfolios and systems. So how do we make those things better understood, the connections between them, and then equip investors to ultimately begin to manage that? We do this through a platform that essentially it's a strategy planning tool and data platform that helps investors essentially integrate this focus across all their policies, programs, and practices, and then via thought leadership and consulting. And this kind of connection between portfolios and systems really does speak to the heart of it. And this was our original logo. I wanted to show this because this is our original logo from 2015. And we were trying to show this bridging, right? This bridging between the different dimensions. And so it was just this idea of bridging between what we focus on in terms of modern portfolio theory around idiosyncratic risk, diversification, capital markets. And then really thinking about system level investing, where we're thinking about systematic risk, systematic opportunity, that we're trying to mitigate the risk to these bigger systems that we all rely on, and that we're really focused as much on the real economy as we are markets. And so that really speaks to the ways that we've been helping impact investors and sustainable investors essentially elevate what they do. And so if you remember I showed this to you earlier, but we modified it with the permission of the impact management platform. And basically what we were trying to get across here was that in the original conception, where it was focused on the enterprises, system-wide risks, and people in the environment, a lot of our work has really gone to show investors that to really drive real progress at these big systems, to help to mitigate these big system-wide risks, you need to actually mobilize not just what your assets and the various things, the windows that you operate through, but really having an eye towards not just impact, but really driving influence. So how are you influencing the overarching kind of thinking and actions of the financial sector to ultimately follow along with you to then is essentially outsize your influence, to really be able to get to the point where you could drive critical action at that system level. Oftentimes we'll say one of the things to bear in mind is that even if, say, you're GPIF, you're the biggest pension plan in the world, you yourself as an institution can't solve climate change. But you, working in concert with a number of other institutional investors to drive change at that industry level, ultimately positions you to be potentially more effective at driving that higher system change. So in addition to starting to equip investors with the kind of tools and the know-how, we've also been establishing the theory and practice. And so I mentioned John LeComic and Jim Hawley earlier. This is their book, Moving Beyond Modern Portfolio Theory. So, and then this one, 21st Century Investing, is the book that I wrote with Steve Leidenberg. And the way to think about these two things is that moving beyond modern portfolio theory really demonstrates why investors should be taking these initial steps. And then 21st century investing then gets you into how. How do you actually do it? And one of the things that John will often say is that we're not just trying to redefine impact investing or sustainable finance. We're really talking about the fundamentals of investing and how we begin to elevate what's practiced. We've also been doing work around partnering with leading academic hubs on system level investing. So this is a group out of Columbia University that I'm an adjunct professor at, where a lot of the leading minds that have been working to help conceptualize this and drive it are teaching at, they're doing research with, ultimately helping to really, this has been a case of an industry where practice has led theory, but we're trying to do our best to get theory to catch up. Which then brings me to my next big point, that investors are, with all of this activity and all of this experimentation happening, investors are increasingly demonstrating how to ultimately adapt their policies, programs, and practices to the system level and adopt new techniques. And so some of the big key ideas here is that where most investors sit is at that portfolio level. So they're thinking about their actions, right? Their actions that they're doing with their investees to ultimately drive impact. Okay, so what they're doing at that level now is trying to draw alignment with net zero commitments, with SDGs, go down the list of some of these global objectives. They're also starting to think about that collective behavior aspect. So when I talked about shifting the financial sector, that's what that means. So they're ultimately trying to understand how the actions that they're taking are ultimately driving greater awareness and influence on the broader financial community. And they're doing all of that with this eye towards beta building. So our beneficiaries and systems becoming more resilient, more healthy as a result of all of these actions. And it's important to note that, these things have to kind of work in concert. So, and the reality is where we can really speak to, investor action, we can speak to attribution and other kind of core concepts that have been emerging. When it comes to collective behavior and beta building, that really gets us more into contribution and more into correlation. So are these, just because the measurement infrastructure and data infrastructure isn't quite where we need it to be just yet. Now, as they start to acknowledge actions at these different levels, they're doing so with an eye towards characteristics of systemic health. I'm not going to go into these too long because that's like a whole other webinar, but just this idea of saying every system has these core characteristics of adaptability, connectivity, clarity, and directionality, and that they're dynamic. They're inherently dynamic because systems are inherently dynamic. I keep saying the word systems are complex. I'm not saying systems are complicated, because I think one of the dilemmas or limitations of just having a portfolio focus is this thinking around, well, if I do this, then this will happen, without really considering the contextual factors that may make that untrue or may create unintended consequences elsewhere. So it's really about trying to understand how the actions that are being taken are ultimately driving this awareness. And really, at the best we can do at this point is to kind of aim for these different characteristics in the hopes that we'll get further and further in terms of refinement on how we capture progress. Now, you're not going to be able to read this. This is just really, I'm going to go through some of this a little bit more detail, but just to say there's essentially a toolkit that they're using. So they're using standard activities or conventional activities that investors use, right? So they have investment belief and policy statements, portfolio construction, engaging, so shareholder engagement, and then ultimately evaluating and selecting managers. In addition to that, they're utilizing what we call these advanced techniques. And at a very high level, if you see them kind of like broken into buckets here, they're essentially doing three things. For the field building, they're changing the way that investors collaborate. As everybody on here knows, the investment community that it tends to be more competitive than it is collaborative. And so really is trying to show that to get to this change, we need collective action. And so they're changing the way investors collaborate. For investment enhancement, they're changing how they invest. So they're thinking about things like take a solutions, right? So a water fund that still profits off the privatization of water resources around the world is not systems in its orientation, but a water fund that is also focused on water access and water quality, that's getting more to the system because it's starting to address some of the big fundamental issues within the system. And then opportunity generation techniques, broadly, they are essentially changing what investors are investing in. So they're embedding concepts around additionality or valuing inherent worth of these different systems. Now, as you go further, each of these different field building techniques, they essentially, what we've tried to do is demonstrate what they look like at these different levels, like how that variation, and then ultimately, what are those characteristics of systems that they're ideally suited to help drive progress at? So in the case, just to do a closer look, something like self-organization. So self-organization is essentially creating the platforms that ultimately help investors to collaborate, share best practices, co-invest, but otherwise drive more of that collective action. When it comes to polity, this is really about how investors collectively are informing the rules of the game so that the regulatory and policy environment become enabling and not constraining to do this kind of work. Investment enhancement, yet again, trying to show what these different approaches look like at different levels. And so in the case here, yet again, talking about solutions, but speaking to that fact that are these business models changing? Are we ultimately really identifying not just thematic alignment, but real driving towards solutions of whatever the issue is? So you go a little bit further, you get into that opportunity generation. And yet again, this deck will be provided to everybody. So you'll be able to really get in closely to be able to look at some of these. But just yet again, it's that variation of, so additionality. So an example of an investor identifies target beneficiaries of their portfolio, and has a stakeholder engagement strategy or requires of managers. At that industry collective behavior, investors strategically invest in target specific beneficiaries, in particular historically marginalized populations that are subject to enhanced symptoms of systemic issues in their corresponding sector. And then at that beta level, investor develops investment products specifically for historically marginalized communities and encourages investment in the development of models that address the systemic issues that affect them most acutely. So you can start to see what that variation of thinking and what that variation of practice looks like at these different levels. Which then brings me to the final point. So that there is this kind of global community of practice that is beginning to emerge and take shape. And part of what we've been doing at TIIP is working with a lot of these investors, but also documenting what are they doing and how does that show variation. And so at a high level, we're seeing that this kind of focus on systems is being integrated at every step in the process. So every investor goes through these steps. They decide what they're going to focus on. They set goals. They allocate assets. They apply investment tools. They leverage advanced techniques, and they evaluate results. And so in each step of the process, we're seeing examples of practice, right? And so in the case of one example on deciding where to focus, so University Pension Plan Ontario, it's a jointly sponsored pension plan in Canada. And they've really centered climate change as the big systemic risk that they're going to focus on. And so when you think about different characteristics around, is there real consensus that that climate change is a thing? Is it actually relevant to their long-term performance? Can they actually effectively do something about it? And then what does the uncertainty look like if we don't act? And so you can see that essentially manifesting here in how they characterize it. So everything from consensus, it's what science tells us. It's alignment with Paris Agreement. It's thinking about the ultimate relevance, right? UPP's ability to realize adequate investment returns and provide retirement benefits depends on a stable climate. So they're already talking about how it's relevant to them making good on their promise to their beneficiaries. Then thinking about effectiveness. So what are those ways, investment beliefs, what they've heard from their members to understand how they can most effectively start to drive change and manage this big risk? And then ultimately the uncertainty. So just that we don't quite know with where the temperature rise is going to land. We don't quite know what that's going to have in terms of implications for environmental severity and instability, what that will impact in terms of migration patterns, how it will essentially reshape the earth and the people in it. When you get into something like setting goals, this example comes from Domini Impact Investments. And so what they were focused on was really trying to understand, okay, where can they uniquely leverage what they do as impact managers and operating in large part through public markets. And so they were looking at the kind of trying to combat biodiversity loss. And that really led them down the road to really understanding forests and deforestation and how that's impacting biodiversity loss in the context of a changing climate. One of the big aha moments they had was that in reality, what we're talking about as we begin to start to manage this, it really speaks to global food production. So essentially the world has become a garden and we need to manage it better. But it has implications, that kind of garden metaphor, because it has implications for the trade-offs that ultimately need to go into taking a systems approach. So if we say biodiversity loss, a lot of that can be mitigated or can be addressed through better global land use for food production. What are we actually talking about? And so this data comes from the UN, and it basically looks at if 71% of the world is ocean, so what we're really talking about is 29% of the world, which is land. And that within that 29%, we're really talking about habitable land because the rest is barren, glaciers, you can't actually cultivate it. So in that 76% of that 29%, what we're fundamentally talking about is essentially half agriculture and half forests, with shrubs and other things. But let's just keep it there. So with that 45% agriculture or 38% or essentially 50-50 with these two things, that's of that 76% of that 29%. And so what you're having to do is make these choices. So in a world where population is exploding, understandable if people are like, well, we need to feed more people. Or people are like, well, climate change is so bad that we need to preserve more forests. It's a trade-off. You literally you can only do one, or you have to do a mix of both, but you have a finite amount or limits to what you can actually affect. And so that was a lot of their work, was trying to figure out, okay, based on that, where can they most effectively intervene as investors? And ultimately, they got to a goal of essentially preserving intact forests. And so a lot of their investment strategies ultimately helped to support that. But it was just that idea of saying that to get to those meaningful goals, they really had to understand the true context with which that systemic issue was manifesting. Another is around allocating assets. And so Cambridge Associates, investment consultant and advisor, they essentially have been looking at different asset classes and really starting to tease out the actual function of that asset class. And so when you think about it from the perspective of private equity or venture capital, that's really great for driving kind of disruptive, innovative change in a system. When you think about things like public equity or public credit, in the case of public equities, they're great for driving kind of incremental evolutionary change within the major companies, increasing transparency and investor confidence. Fixed income, that's where you get into, particularly when issued by government, creates public goods. So think around education or hospitals, things like that. And everything in between, each of these different asset classes have that different kind of functional utility, and different systems under stress need different kinds of capital. And so that's one of the big things to bear in mind. And so then what they talk about is like, well, so what are some of those? How does that manifest? How does that speak towards climate solutions for these different asset classes? And then not forgetting, though, that at the end of the day, when you're constructing these portfolios, you still have to control for a lot of these traditional things around growth, stability, diversification, liquidity. The last couple steps go into adapting conventional tools. So let's go back to the Westpath example. One of the big things that they've been out there talking about is around how we need to broaden how we think about shareholder engagement. So it's no longer just engaging company by company. We now need to be also engaging our managers. And so that's one of the aspects that they've layered into it, as well as engaging on policy, with the idea being that we'll need progress on all three of those levels if engagement, how we think of it, stewardship, shareholder engagement, if it's going to ultimately be fit for purpose for today's world. And then finally, utilizing advanced techniques. And so this comes from our friends at Fidelity International. And so what they were doing was thinking about, okay, if they're setting goals and they're focusing at these different levels, at that system level, at that industry sector, at that firm entity level, that the goals are going to be slightly different. And then the kinds of actions that they're going to be taking, it goes back to, are they trying to change how investors are collaborating? Are they trying to change how investors are investing? Are they trying to change what is being invested in? And each layer has different kinds of actions. And so it's useful to bear in mind that all of these things, once again, have to kind of work together. And then finally, on evaluating results, Colorful Capital, investment fund manager that I helped co-found, one of the things that we were really trying to figure out was, okay, when you're measuring progress like this, yes, the company portfolio level, a lot of these kind of classic DEI type metrics, but then really understanding at a industry sector level, how do you know that you're changing awareness and action? And then ultimately having an understanding of, at that system level, is the population or the ultimate beneficiaries, in this case, LGBTQ plus people, has their livelihoods actually changed? Can we look at that ratio of percentage of LGBTI population below the poverty threshold to the percentage of overall population below the poverty threshold? And can we start to understand how these activities at the industry sector and company level are correlated with changes that happen at that system level? Now, with all that activity happening, there is this kind of growing community of practice. And so these are just some of the institutions that have come through our investor cohort programs and training programs, but it really speaks to this global orientation and more investors understanding that if we're going to tackle these big systemic issues, we really do have to be operating collectively to drive that. we've been slowly building the evidence base for investors that are doing this. This is another resource that I will give to Yuka-san to share with folks. And the bigger point or the bigger acknowledgement that comes out of all of this is to just simply say that if we do all of these things, if we begin to change how we collaborate, how we invest, what we invest in, that we can start to enable the emergence of a new picture, a new paradigm, one that actually is a fix that ultimately leads to a deeper solution, right? So if it was this whole idea of a bedrock of externality denying capitalism, this view that markets are the solution, and really viewing the world as this kind of reductionist machine, that's complicated. If we can switch, and if we do all these things, we can get to seeing the world as this kind of emergent complex system that we can say that markets are useful and that ultimately we're respecting the limits of resources on the planet to create this kind of more sustainable and impactful economy. And I would say that one of the things that my partner, Steve, will often say, and he's, 79 years young, as a godfather of this whole industry, and he'll say, if we do all of this, we'll actually fulfill the promise of sustainable and impact investing. And so with that, thank you, and I will turn it back to Yuka-san.
Thank you very much, Bill-san. That's been really great and it's been fun. So from now on, I'll just really briefly summarize what you've discussed in Japanese, or at least I'll try to do that. Then I'll switch to Himura-san afterwards. So let me share your slide on my own so that I can... Hey. すみません。ここからは私がですね、本当に簡単にですね、ビルさんがお話しされたことをちょっと、日本語でご説明したいと思います。正確じゃないところもあると思いますので、どうぞご容赦ください。今回ですね、4つのテーマでお話しくださいました。システムというのは本当に重要であるということ。それから、そうですね。じゃあ、システムレベルインベスティングをどうやればいいかということの、セオリーとプラクティスっていうのがどんどん出てきているということ。そして、how ですね。どうやって、投資家はそれをですね、行っていったらいいのか。で、最後ですね、グローバルコミュニティの話をちょっとしてくださいました。このあたりがすごく重要なのかなと思うんですけれども、その投資家がですね、今受け取っている、リターンというものの 90% というのがですね、それぞれの個別株からのリターンということではなくて、その市場全体のリスクからのですね、リターンというのが90% であるという、皮肉な事実があると。つまりその市場全体のリスクに影響を与える、そのリスクを低減していくということが、資産運用業界がリスクの低減効果をもたらして、そして、より良いですね、リターンを確保していくためには重要だというようなことを、この、ジェームス・フォーリーさんという方と、ジョン・ルコミニックさん、後から出てきますけれども、こちらの著者の方がおっしゃっているというところです。それから、そういった思想に基づいて、例えばカリフォルニア州のですね、年金制度ですね、カルスターズはですね、このシステムレベルの投資戦略を、ポートフォリオに入れるということをコミットしていると。これは組合員の資産が長期的に、保全されているより良いリターンをもたらすためにはですね、こういったことをすべきである。気候変動のようなことをやっていくべきであるという、思いに基づいていたりですね。それから、このウェルスパスベネフィットインベストメントというですね、これも、投資顧問会社だと思いますけれども、こちらもですね、気候変動のようなシステミックリスクを管理をしていくと、マネージしていくと、そういったことをやっていくアセットマネージャーに、資金を任せていくと、なことを決めているというところです。はい。で、こちらですね、TIIP さんのスライドでよく出てくる図なんですけれども、このイディオシンクラティックリスク、その個別的なリスクと個別的な機会というものに注目して、今までインパクト投資というのがなされていたんだけれども、そうではなくて、このシステムワイドリスクとかですね、それが、人々や、地球に与える影響というのを、 考えないといけないというような図になっています。このシステムワイドリスクとかですね、人々及びその地球環境ということが、この、それぞれの、投資先ですね。ここに影響を、ディペンデンシーと書いてありますけれども、影響を与えていくということがより真実じゃないかということですね。ですので、この赤い部分、People and Natural Environment ということに目を向けなければならないということになります。で、この図もなんかすごく、秀逸だなと思うんですけれども、アダム・スミスの言うところのこのインビジブルハンド、神の見えざる手というのは、この劇場の中で、これによって全てが解決されるというようなことを言ってますけれども、その下とかですね、この、アンメンショナブルフット、言及されていない足ということですけれども、足でいろいろなコストをですね、実はかけていて、ゴミを撒き散らしていて、エクスタナダリティーズを撒き散らしているということを、これはカーテンの影で隠しているということなんですけれども、そのうちですね、このカーテンの影が、カーテンの中をですね、オーバーウェルム、それを凌駕してしまう、そういうことになっていくだろうということになります。で、今ですね、いろいろなそのサステナブルファイナンス、インパクトファイナンスというもの出てきてますけれども、ソーコールドって言い方してますけれども、それはまるでですね、このエクスターナリティディナインキャピタリズム、外部性を否定している、この資本主義の下で、その下がどんどん既存されているような土台の上でですね、非常にグリーンな、プロジェクトなんかをやっている。つまり、この下がどんどんですね、土台がこけてしまっているのにもかかわらず、そこに手当てをしないまま、一番表層にですね、このエコーフレンドリーなことをやっているというような状況なのではないかというふうになっています。私がばっかり喋ってちょっとあれなんで簡単に飛ばしますけれども、この TIIP というのはですね、2015年に、こういった考えのもとに、作られたコンサルティングファームで、このインパクトシステムレベルインベストメントというものを広げていこうということで作られた、会社になります。で、この無断ポートフォリオセオリーですね。こちらは先ほどもありましたけれども、その特定の個社に対するリスクに対してですね、それをどうやって最大化していくかという話ですけれども、こちらのシステムレベルインベスティングというのは、このシステムリスクを考えていく。そうすると、この社会環境、それから、金融のシステムに対して、働きかけていかなきゃいけないということになりますし、なりますということになります。で、先ほどの図を書き換えたものですけれども、こちらですね。このあたりが、ぜひ QA なりでお話していただければと思いますけれども、この個別の、投資だけではなくて、システム全体にですね、働きかける。で、そうすると、このリスクが、低減して、全体の、リターンが上がっていくという、そういうサイクルを生んでいこうというような取り組みになります。こちら、左側の方は日本でも翻訳されてますけれども、こういった方たちが提唱しているというところになります。で、TIP さんがやっているのは、この5つのですね、柱に基づいていろいろなことをやってきているということで、やっぱりですね、このエデュケーションとか、こういったことをですね、コンファレンスとか、後で出てきますけれども、このフィールドビルディング的なですね、活動をされているというのは非常に特徴的かなというふうに思っています。はい。3番目と4番目はですね、どういうふうにやっていこうかというところですので、こちらはちょっと細かくなりますので、見ておいていただければと思いますが、特に4のところですね。こちらは、それぞれのこの何をやるかとかですね、このゴールをどういうふうにセットするかとか、そういったところに、こんな会社がこんな取り組みをしてますという、実例も挙げていただいているので、これも非常に参考になるんじゃないかなというふうには思いました。拙いですが、私からの、ご説明は以上にしまして、それではですね、木村さんの方にですね、お話をしていただけるとありがたいと思います。
はい。ビルさん、thank you very much for your presentation. I like the picture of invisible hands with unmentionable foot. I also like the term system level investing. There are various classifications and descriptions of related terms. And the PRI does not use the term system level investing, but it has always advocated an investment approach based on system level investing, system level thinking. So I will discuss how PRI has strengthened its approach to system level risks and how that approach relates to what TIIP calls system level investing. And as Bill-san mentioned, important aspect of understanding system level risk is its difference from idiosyncratic risk. And idiosyncratic risk can generally be mitigated in an investment portfolio through the use of diversification. The opposite of idiosyncratic risk is a system level risk, which is an overall risk that affects all asset classes and therefore cannot be mitigated by diversification. So when we're discussing system level risks, our focus is not on alpha, but on beta, which is the overall market return. So it's very important to keep this in mind, as Bill-san mentioned. So next slide, please. The PRI community includes a wide variety of signatories with different investment mandates and investment approaches. But in recent years, we have seen an increase in the number of signatories who are interested in system level thinking. This slide shows the result of PRI signatory consultation, which took place about 18 months ago. It's very clear that investors are moving from ESG risk management to sustainability outcomes. Many investors have a high level of aspiration to equate responsible investment with taking action on sustainability outcomes linked to SDGs. And this is a fundamental shift in the way that PRI signatories are thinking about responsible investment. So why are investors seeking to change their investment strategies? I think the reason is very simple. The gap between real-world outcomes and global goals, such as SDGs, has not narrowed in any way. And with a widening gap between real-world outcomes and global goals, our investment portfolios remain exposed to system-level sustainability-related risks that investors cannot diversify away, such as those derived from climate change, biodiversity loss, or social instability. Without addressing these system-level risks, we investors will not be able to enhance financial returns over the long term because financial returns depend on the long-term stability of social and environmental systems. This is why long-term institutional investors need to focus on system-level thinking. And the PRI has undertaken various initiatives to promote ESG investment and at the same time to instill system-level thinking among investors. So let me give a brief history of these initiatives by the PRI. Next slide, please. And as you may know, the PRI 6 principles do not mention sustainability outcomes at all. But when the 6 principles were established in 2006, the preamble stated that applying the principles could better align investors to broader objectives of society. So when PRI released the blueprint for responsible investment in 2017, the PRI formalized SDGs' role in framing these societal objectives, committing to enable real-world impact aligned with SDGs and to contribute to a better world for all. So next, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So the blueprint established in 2017 is the PRI's mandate for the next decade. Among ambitious agenda for the next 10 years is to encourage investors to shape sustainability outcomes linked to global goals such as SDGs. And next slide, please. In line with the blueprint for responsible investment, PRI augmented the guideline of stewardship activities in 2019 in order to increase the effectiveness of active ownership in producing real-world outcomes at scale. Active ownership 2.0 could be interpreted as synonymous with macro stewardship and system-level stewardship. Collaborative engagement, such as Climate Action 100+ and Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, are typical examples of active ownership 2.0. These initiatives are important initiatives in which investors participate as field building to address system-level risks. Next slide, please. And in 2020, PRI released a new investment framework, Investing with SDG Outcomes. It provides a high-level framework for any investors looking to shape real-world outcomes in line with SDGs. Focusing on shaping SDG outcomes requires expanding the analysis of financially material ESG issues for individual investee companies in order to include parallel analysis of the most important outcomes for society and environment at a system level. Next slide. Yeah, so in 2021, PRI released a groundbreaking report, a legal framework for impact. This report highlights the key concept of investing for sustainability impact, or IFSI for short. IFSI is an investment approach where investors intentionally attempt to influence the behavior of investee companies and other third parties, including policymakers and other peer investors, in accessible ways that can help achieve overarching sustainability outcomes reflected in global goals, such as SDGs. This concept is broader than impact investing and has the advantage that its approach can be more easily applied to an investor's entire portfolio. Under this investment approach, there is room for companies with negative externalities to be included in the portfolio, as long as they have a credible transition pathway to reduce their negative outcomes. And in implementing IFSI, it's important to adopt field building strategies, including collaborative engagement and policy engagement. And this report aims to clarify how regulators view IFSI and provide concrete support to impact investors and mainstream investors wishing to invest for sustainability impact. And broadly speaking, the report's conclusion is that the extent to which the law requires or permits IFSI is significant. Next slide, please. And PRI is now currently working with signatories to design progression pathways framework to be launched in 2025. The main objective of progression pathways framework is to provide guidance for signatories to advance their responsible investment practices under the pathway they choose based on their investment purpose. 3 pathways are available based on legal framework for impact. Pathway A is for investors focusing on ESG risk management. And pathways B and C are for investors pursuing sustainability outcomes. And the key point here is that for each pathway, the higher the level, the more system level thinking is required. And next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And this slide provides a timeline history of PRI's approach to system level risks and sustainability outcomes that I have described. I think PRI's approach to system level risks and sustainability outcomes can be interpreted as what TIIP calls system level investing. The term system level investing may be new to many seminar participants, but I think it's broadly similar to the PRI's approach to system-level risks and sustainability outcomes in a sense that it seeks to mitigate system-level risks rather than just managing idiosyncratic risks. And I would like to see if Bill-san agrees with my interpretation or not. Next slide, please.
He does.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this slide is about field building. As Bill-san mentioned, to mitigate system-level risks, investors can use traditional, conventional, and advanced investment techniques, one of which is field building. Field building means that investors indirectly influence investee companies by changing the behavior and views of stakeholders and changing norms and rules that surround companies. The field building tactic acknowledges the interconnected web of stakeholders around investee companies, known as fields, which profoundly influence corporate behavior. By reshaping these fields, investors can drive sustainable change in investee companies. The term field building may be new to many seminar participants, but again, it's not necessarily a new concept. I think that PRI serves as a platform for field building. In the PRI community, signatories share expertise with their peers to develop and improve best practices in responsible investment and policy engagement through PRI and active ownership 2.0, such as climate action and net zero asset owner alliance, are classic examples of field building. And the last slide. Yeah, but field building is an essential tool for system level investing, but it also presents some challenges. So I would like to ask Bill-san about these thoughts. So first, system level stewardship may cause trade-off among portfolio companies. Universal owners are encouraged to adopt system level stewardship and push for market-wide initiatives to reduce environmental externalities and control system level risk. Specifically, in order to mitigate the risk of climate change to the long-term value of portfolio, we universal owners may want to push carbon emitters to cut output, whether or not that promotes enterprise value. And any serious effort to control carbon emissions will have winners and losers. Companies that will benefit from reduction and other companies that will bear the brunt of mitigation efforts. In other words, system-level stewardship may entail substantial trade-off among portfolio companies. But is it really possible and permissible for universal owners to sacrifice single firm value, even when doing so increase the value of overall portfolio? And the second is political exposure. I think Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, is a typical example. He has made his stance on ESG very clear and helped mainstream ESG, right? But this is a nice field building. But in the US, Republicans have targeted and criticized him. And the third is the free rider problem of field building. I think a sustainable society is like public goods, which always come with a free rider problem. And if there are too many free riders in the investment industry, field building will not be effective, and SDGs will never be achieved. And finally, I'm concerned about system level washing, because it is difficult to quantitatively measure the impacts of system level strategies. So I want to hear Bill-san's thoughts on these challenges of field building. So how do you address these challenges? Thank you.
木村さん、ありがとうございました。Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Kimura. And I think I will pass the facilitator to 勝地さん、because it will be really tough to facilitate in this discussion. 山田さん、ここから先はファシリテーションよろしくお願いいたします。
はい、皆さん、こんにちは。今田です。We have about 20 minutes for the Q&A. And of course, Kimura-san asked some specific questions of Bill, especially about the challenges of field building. But before turning to him to address these questions, I would like to see if people have any questions. If you do, could you maybe show your screen and then raise your hand, or like use the raise the hand button to indicate that you have questions? No? Okay, so we'll be waiting for your questions. But okay, before turning to Bill about these specific questions about the field building posed by Kimura-san, maybe I should ask you two questions first, Bill. One related to what Mr. Kimura talked about. As you mentioned, influencing is becoming as important as demonstrating an impact of your work. And when you talk about influencing, who do you think are the biggest or like most important stakeholders that the investor community should try to influence?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So when we think of influence, we also think about it from the perspective of what is the need of the system. So thinking some systemic issues are going to require more government intervention. So really, when you're thinking about influence, it's thinking about government. Some it's going to be about influencing other investors, and that's really the big thing. Or there could be situations where there just isn't decision useful data for operating in this way for investors. So then it's going to be influencing the kind of data infrastructure. So each system under stress has different needs, and so you're thinking about influence from different perspectives.
Right. Okay. So your influencing target needs to change based on your priority and your strategy. Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
One thing just to add to that, and this should be consistent, I think, with all my comments, and you'll hear my responses. Imagine if you could, all right, so an index. Most investors, they're passive investors, they're investing in indexes. Think of an index that instead of it being composed of best-in-class companies on a particular thematic area, think about an index that was composed of the needs of a system. So you would be thinking about different industries, different sectors, different kinds of companies. But that's, I mean, the fullest manifestation of all this is really just this idea of it's taking the system and putting that at the core of the investment thesis.
Okay, great. So, okay, everybody, so we are still waiting for your questions. Use your, okay, good. We have a hand from Kobayashi-san. But if you could hold your questions for a moment, I would like to ask Bill any reactions from Mr. Kimura's presentation about the PRI work.
Yeah, it was a great presentation, so well done. And I wonder, Yuka-san, could you put up that last slide of his? I think it'll be helpful. So because we've thought a lot about these different levels, and it just I need to have it in front of me just so I can remember each one.
That's okay.
Okay, so definitely in terms of system level stewardship and trade-offs, this is a real thing. But it is something where, once again, it's a real thing because of the limitations of our current system. And just take, for example, so I mentioned University Pension Plan as one of the investors that we've worked with. One of the interesting things that University Pension Plan ran into when they were starting to develop their system level strategy was just this idea of saying they wanted to start to engage Canadian or Canada-based companies as part of their overarching system level strategy. So they were thinking, well, we'll do that through Climate Action 100+, because that, amplify their influence, all of that. Well, what they found was that of the companies that were being targeted by Climate Action 100+, only 6 of them were Canadian. So basically only 6 Canadian companies met the threshold for engagement by Climate Action 100+. So what they did was they actually created a equivalent of Climate Action 100+, but specifically focused on Canadian companies. And so that was one of those things where when you think of these kinds of different trade-offs and the implications of how we manage them, a lot of this, back and forth that we're dealing with is simply because the industry and the kind of infrastructure is still taking shape to be able to enable investors to do this most effectively. So yes, there will definitely be trade-offs. And one of the insights from Domini Impact Investments was that the business models are going to change. So it's not just about saying we're not going to be value extractive. It's about saying, well, there's some level of extraction that has to occur for us to engage in commerce and markets, but that it needs to be balanced with a certain level of value preservation and value creation. So we essentially have to walk on 3 feet now of extraction, creation, and preservation. So that's where it's just right now, the infrastructure, the understanding is still catching up. And so that's why I think where we see these trade-offs, they seem really profound, but in reality, it's just because we're constrained by what we currently have at our hands. In terms of political exposure, this is actually something that's come up to the point that Kimura-san was saying, particularly in the US. And what we found, there's the whole reason of using system level, it gets away from, we're talking about systemic risks, right? And chief investment officers, they have to think about systemic risk. That's like part of their job. And really, when we're talking about systemic risks, we're talking about intergenerational risk. So these risks are long-standing. They will be something that affects future generations. And so, part of fiduciary duty, particularly in the US, is that whole idea of duty of impartiality or duty of loyalty, right? That there's all these different aspects to fiduciary duty that we don't prioritize as much, but actually do exist. And so with duty of impartiality, you can't preference the needs of today's beneficiaries at the cost of tomorrow's. And so when you think about that political exposure aspect, at least in the US, I'm not sure how it scopes out to Japan, but a lot of institutional investors are finding that it's something where as long as they can frame it in terms of systemic intergenerational risk, it gets them away from a lot of the debate and the noise around sustainability as a lightning rod of a term right now. In terms of the free rider problem, absolutely. That's why the focus of our work at TIIP has really been on the asset owners, and in particular, those that are willing to kind of push the market. In that way, it kind of, there will still be free riders for sure. But if asset owners are the ones pushing it, like asset managers and consultants are not going to do this necessarily out of the kindness of their heart, right? But asset owners who have to, if you're GPIF, what was the quote that I read one time where they were like, they're not a long-term investor, they're a super long-term investor because their time horizon is 100 years. And so when you think about that, and you think about the need of asset owners to really exercise their voice, that's where you can start to get to addressing some of that free rider problem. And then the difficulty of measuring and the risk of system level washing absolutely is something, it keeps me up at night. It keeps a lot of us up at night that have been really pushing a lot of this work. But that's where the industry, the more we get organized, the more we get clarity about what this is and what this isn't, and what good looks like, what best practices look like, I think we'll start to be able to mitigate some of the threat of that.
Great. Okay. Thank you for going through these 4 challenges that Dr. Kimura has pointed out. Do you have any particular reactions, Kimura-san, at this point?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. So, Bill-san, how widespread the concept of system level investing in the United States? I mean, can the concept of system level investing be targeted by Republican parties or not?
So as long as we continue so it has, thus far, it has managed to avoid some of the, how do I say it? Some of the turmoil that's happening in the political system right now. But it's not immune, right? Like the more that Republicans see this as a potential point of contention for them, it will for sure get targeted. But I think yet again, because we're not talking about sustainability, we're not using the term impact. These are those trigger terms here in the US in particular. That's why really keep coming back to its systemic risk, because that's where we can start to continue to avoid this. Doesn't mean that it will be immune from it, but like I'm currently doing this webinar from Australia, where I'm doing a workshop with PRI, with Impact Investing Australia, and the momentum, the interest is just incredible. Same thing in Canada, same thing in the UK and EU. So it's one of those things where I think, yet again, the more that people just acknowledge that there's a difference between idiosyncratic risks and systemic risks, the more that we can start to get away from a lot of the terminology problem like ESG or whatever that has really absorbed a lot of the discussion, at least in the US. That might be me being naive. That might be me being naive. But I think that as long as we can continue to hold the line, hopefully that will be true.
Yeah, okay, we'll take your point definitely, Bill. Thank you. Let's go to questions. So I think we have a question from Kobayashi-san from Campos MA. And also Matsubara-san had his screen on. Does it mean he has questions? If you do, please indicate that too. So let's go to Kobayashi-san first.
こんにちは。今田さん、これ日本語でもよろしいですか？すいません、ありがとうございます。ビルさんにご質問なんですけれども、システムレベルリスクの重要性っていうのは十分理解しているんですが、どういう状態、どういう投資行動であれば、ビルさんのおっしゃるシステムレベル投資に当たるのかっていうところをお伺いしたいんですけれども、例えば、多くの日本の機関投資家は、投資先企業に対して GHG 削減のエンゲージメントっていうのをしていますと。で、ポートフォリオレベルで、GHG の削減を、例えば2030年までに 50% 削減といった目標を立てて、行動していますと。で、これは、ビルさんのおっしゃるシステムレベル投資に該当するのか否か、こちらちょっとまず確認させていただきたいんですが、お願いします。
A question for you, Bill. Many investors in Japan do understand what the system level risk is all about. But my question is about what constitutes as system level investing. For example, including ourselves, but many other investors do work with portfolio companies with regard to GHG reduction engagement. And so we say, maybe if you could reduce your GHG emission by 50% by 2030, that is a very good contribution to environment and society. Do these kind of investing constitute as system level investing? If not, what is missing from this kind of engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So I think the additional questions would be, of the particular companies that you're engaging, are these bellwether companies that if one of them or a collection of them change, would that fundamentally have implications for other companies and how they operate within a sector? So that's question one. I think question two is, it's really thinking about, here's a good illustration. So Vale is a mining company. And so a couple of years ago, Vale kept having these disasters at a number of their mines. And one of them in particular, a couple of hundred people died. So there's all sorts of safety issues related to labor or whatnot. It was I want to say it was the Church Commissioners of England, so pension in UK. And they basically led a group of investors. So they themselves started to engage Vale to address safety issues at the actual company. In the process of that, they started to realize, oh, this is a problem across the industry, across the entire mining industry. And so they started to work with other investors to ultimately increase transparency across the entire industry. So creating data infrastructure so we could start to understand what are those safety violations, what is, safety and security and health for workers What does that actually look like? And then implement that so that they're essentially systematically working across the industry to elevate the entire industry. Now, if you do that with an eye towards inequality and saying, okay, the workers are really the beneficiaries of all this, that if we can make all of these safety standards and really value workers, that's going to somehow start to contribute to their livelihood and to their progress and all of that. That's how you start to get to that next level. And one of the great quotes that I remember, it was the Council of Ethics, which was like a group of Swedish pensions. And they basically said that when they started engaging a company. When they got smarter, they engaged an entire sector, and now they're engaging in the actual problem. And so that's really when you think about those different levels. So it's not to say that what you're doing isn't system oriented, but it is really thinking more holistically about how is that beyond, like, what is the nature of those? Are those bellwether companies that could shift an industry? Or are there some other aspects to this that make the significance of what you're doing really have the implications for the system?
小林さんよろしいですか? Do you have, I think you have a follow-up question, right?
Thank you for Bill's, and so I understand the holistic approach is appropriate for your systemic risk investment. Is that right?
To say it one more time?
そう、ごめんなさい、今ですね。
I think he's trying to confirm your point being that going beyond your portfolio company and thinking about what like a holistic approach of industry-wide thinking will lead to system level investing.
Yeah, so absolutely. And the way that, I mean, there's still a lack of infrastructure to be able to prove the connection between those actions and then how beneficiaries are ultimately being more resilient, more improved, whatever. But yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
はい、ありがとうございました。
Okay, anybody else has any questions? We only have like 3 minutes. Okay, so maybe, yeah, it's I think we do need to more time, but I think unfortunately we need to close soon. And we have given Bill a floor to speak a lot of stuff. So maybe I would like to ask Kimura-san to give us any closing reflections on remarks, if that's okay.
Thank you. So I think many seminar participants understand what system level investing is and why it is important, but they do not necessarily know how to address system level risks and how to implement system level investing. But not to worry, PRI as well as TIIP exists to help investors, right? So PRI is a platform of field building for system level investing as well as ESG investing. And as I have shown you in the timeline of PRI's efforts over the years, investors in the PRI community can learn expertise and best practices of system level concept and act in collaboration with their peers. And in addition, we investors will be able to evaluate and monitor progress on the system level investing through PRI's progression pathways framework, which will be launched in 2025. And I also think that this Japan impact-driven financing initiative may also serve as a platform of field building for system-level investing. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have 30 seconds for Bill to give us the closing word.
Just to say that appreciate everybody taking the time. And I know that a lot of this can seem either overwhelming or just it's unclear where to start. And I would say that to the extent people are interested to learn more, obviously talk to the co-hosts of this, talk to PRI, talk to the Impact Finance Initiative. And and really encourage more opportunities like this. In addition, TIIP is doing a virtual one-day intensive that'll be on July 11th, where we have various faculty that have come through the program, helping us to instruct on the different steps in the process. So lots of resources are out there if you go looking for them, and happy to answer more questions as they come up.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Kimura-san. Back to you, Ogasawa-san.
それでは、これで終わりにしたいと思います。今回ですね、これを公開したいと思っておりますし、うまくいけばですね、英語のスクリプトも取れましたので、ちょっとそちらも公開するようにですね、ちょっと事務局の方で作業したいと思います。Thank you so much for the presentation, Bill-san. Thank you so much for Dr. Kimura-san's great, insightful presentation too. また次回何かですね、引き続き、この、宣言でやっていきますので、どうぞこれからもよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.